Welcome into another Johnny Torch live broadcast. We have a special broadcast at literally quarter of 2 in the morning here. We're doing one. And it was very important to me that we do this broadcast as soon as I was physically able to. Uh, Apologies if my voice is still a little out of shape, but had a very bad cold for the past week or so. Fortunately, started breaking up and feeling a bit better around the 4th of July. So happy 4th of July to everyone out there who is celebrating and enjoying uh, the festivities of a 4th of July weekend that we just came out of. But shortly before the 4th of July, we had some sad news, and I wanted to make sure that we comment on it here on the Johnny Torch Live program. And we're going into Superman week, where, the story's going to be about the movie. I think a lot of the reviews are starting to drop right now, even as we speak. But I didn't want to get lost in the shuffle, the great Jim Shooter. So we intend to eulogize the great Jim Shooter for a few moments here. And I thought I would do this live instead of just recording it in case it's late here on the East Coast, but if anyone is out there, be it on the West Coast, be it outside America, feel free to drop your comments in if you're watching this live. But yeah, the great Jim Shooter passed on. He had suffered with cancer for the last couple of years. It was kind of generally known that his health was declining. Um, but in recent years, really hit his stride on the convention circuit and in doing interviews. There's many interviews, especially one I really prize this one, where the interview was literally about 7.5 hours long, and they did a follow-up video that was like another 3.5 hours long. So anything you ever wanted to know about Jim Shooter, you could see in that interview or those interviews. About 11 hours worth of content at the end of it all. Um, but again, the man was a revolutionary, certainly one of my heroes in the business. If you were a fan of Bronze Age, Marvel, it all is responsible from Jim Shooter. He basically did everything or led everything that happened in Marvel during the late 70s through to the late 80s for a good 10 years there. And well, let's start at the beginning. Jim started, as many know, as a writer for DC Comics back when he was 14 years old, something that was probably unheard of then as well as today. But he worked for Mort Weisinger, who was a less than pleasant individual. He was in charge of DC in those days, and Jim submitted a lot of stories for Legion of Superheroes, Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes. And he made an imprint there, creating a vast array of characters. He created Parasite for Superman, a character that continues on to this day as being one of the Man of Steel's big villains. And from there, he also did a lot of work. Then, what is it? He went from there to Marvel, I think, in the mid 70s, transitioning over there to Marvel, where he was editor over Avengers, where I believe he did some of his first work writing Avengers in the mid 70s. And those were a lot of good stories that came out of that period for Avengers. There was the Korvac saga. I believe Ultron came under his watch. I don't know if he created Ultron, but it was around that period. And that was when he sort of started to revolutionize the Marvel way. And before then, pretty much post Stan Lee, post Roy Thomas, there was a revolving door for editors in Marvel. And when Jim took over, he pretty much laid the law down. He was one of the few that was not afraid to basically clamp down on everything that was coming out of Marvel, making sure that it was up to snuff, high quality, making sure the train ran on time. And this kind of led to some of the, less than flattering stories that people that were working under him at the time tried to paint a picture of him as being sort of tyrannical and so on and so forth. But there's a lot of times where you have to have somebody that's willing to say no. A lot of famous stories abound. For example, of course, one of the more famous ones was the death of Jean Grey was originally not going to happen. Claremont was just going to have her basically return and be rehabilitated and what have you from the Dark Phoenix. And Jim said, well, basically, she destroyed a planet of people. You can't just have her, get a mulligan with that. And basically, after going back and forth, Claremont suggested that he kill her. And Shooter was like, fine. And then Claremont sort of wanted to back off that, but the die was cast. And an interesting story basically came out of that. It's like that was a legendary story, that Dark Phoenix resolution, because something like that didn't happen that often in comics, where the good guy turns evil and then is basically killed at the end for their crimes. So again, lots of lot of firsts under his tenure. I think they had the first sort of mass team up book with Contest of Champions, which was one of my favorites. When I was a kid, that was the first. That was a big thing because you seen so many heroes joining together, and it was a battle with a cosmic bent because you had, I believe it was Death and I forget who the other one was. Not the Collector. I think he was dead, and they were trying to bring him back or something. But again, that was a favorite story of mine, and that was sort of a precursor to what Shooter basically led with Secret Wars. Secret Wars, of course, was the sort of pinnacle of the team up, and had all hands on deck, all heroes versus all villains, the Beyonder in charge, and that basically grew out of sort of this toy deal they had, which you know uh, they wanted to make action figures, they wanted to make play sets, they wanted to make vehicles, and it really didn't matter if any of that was accurate to the books. But what they did was basically had a springboard by having these books launch the toys. And it was a very successful. I mean, I remember having all the toys. I mean, I think I had most of them. Some of them were harder to find, some of them were harder to get. But again, that was a big seller, and it sort of rivaled what DC was doing with superpowers. And a lot of changes happened there. He allowed John Byrne to replace Ben Grimm with She-Hulk, and of course the symbiote costume came out of Secret Wars. As a kid, I was not a huge fan of changing the hero costumes or the Fantastic Four roster. I really didn't like that Ben Grimm wasn't on the Fantastic Four, but that's the story for another time. Probably when we get into the Fantastic Four movie, maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. But it turned out, though, that was laying the groundwork for one of the more interesting storylines for Spider-Man, that the symbiote costume wasn't just going to be a costume. There was going to be ramifications for him bringing that back from the Secret Wars world. Again, a lot of things were under Jim's tenure. We had Dazzler was created. That was another multimedia campaign that was going to kick off. It was going to be a movie. It was going to star Bo Derek. Jim was responsible for writing the screenplay. I think he wrote it in a week or something like that. I think you can find the comic book adaptation of that online somewhere. I know I've read it. Not great, to be honest with you, but again, it was an early attempt. You know what I mean? This wasn't something that was gone through. I don't think serious drafts, but again, there was a lot of stuff that Jim Shooter was responsible for bringing Marvel back to prominence. And again, he was a guy that knew when to put his foot down. I think one of the stories is Bill Mantlo wanted Spider-Man to be having a child out of wedlock, and Jim Shooter, you know, obviously he put his foot down and made sure that that wasn't going to happen, because that's what was important. The thing is keeping these characters, keeping their legacies intact, and that's why I bemoan many years where they could have had Jim Shooter back at Marvel, where they could have had him running the show. And of course, he unceremoniously was bounced from the company in the late 80s. Of course, he went on to do Valiant Comics and, more tragedy in his professional life where, he went through Valiant, Defiant. I think there was even a couple more. Broadway sticks in my mind, I'm not sure. But he was always trying to put the best foot forward for the genre, for comics, to make sure that comics were always going to be there for the next generation. And he did an awful lot for Marvel, for our generation who grew up with the Bronze Age. And sadly, no one took advantage of those talents later on. Um, he like I said, he did some collaborations, he did some work, he continued to write off and on. He wrote some stories that, of course, were not as well received. He did the Incredible Hulk magazine issue, which controversial at the time. The YMCA issue, I'll just leave it at that. He also did, well, he co-plotted Avengers 200, which was another big brouhaha, a lot of controversy about that. Ms. Marvel in that episode. And, there's a lot of interesting things that, you know, came with his tenure. And I think what he left us, though, was a legacy of always wanting to leave the characters in the best condition after you played with them. That's kind of what I think every good writer is supposed to do when they partake of the genre, when they, when you're playing in somebody else's playground. You want to leave the characters the way you found them. You want to leave them intact and with dignity. And I think that's what, for the most part, Shooter did with Marvel. He made sure that they were always respectful, respectable characters. Um, he didn't let anyone basically just run roughshod over them. Of course, he also introduced the line Star Comics, which was important for me when I was a kid as well, because you had a lot of other licensed characters that ended up being brought to the fold. The Ewoks and droids. I don't think droids lasted that long, but then again, they didn't last long on television either. They got their own, series. He-Man, Fraggle Rock, Muppet Babies, anything that you thought of in the 80s was cool as a kid, you know, Jim Shooter brought them in as comics. And of course, you also had, the Star Wars run was brought in under his eye around that time when he was editor. And of course, that was very successful. I mean, people seem to look back at it now and kind of mock it, but at the time, that was a very successful coup to have Star Wars there and Marvel being so successful with it. I mean, there was a lot of good writers there, Joe Duffy and Archie Goodwin. There was a lot of, actually very memorable stories along with that. And they had to do that in the auspices of Lucasfilm. But at the same time, they still were very creative and they were allowed to be imaginative. Also, Indiana Jones. They had the Indiana Jones franchise for a while there, which was also very good. I'd like to go over those comics again, perhaps do a video about them. Um, Also, during that period, there was uh, there was a lot of the Marvel team up, the Marvel 2-in-1. There was a lot of those team up books, for lack of a better term, that again, that was another thing that I feel like should be brought back, that really introduced a lot of the characters that were on the periphery of Marvel. They were showcased along with Spider-Man, at least in most cases. Sometimes they would have another hero, or in the case of Marvel 2-in-1, it was the Thing. Back when the Thing was very popular, of course, I don't know, kind of don't know why they haven't really pushed him as much lately either in the last 20 or so years. But again, anything that was really positive about Marvel in those days that I grew up with, it's all goes back to Shooter, Jim Shooter, basically running the helm. And you know, uh, again, GI Joe. When you look at a lot of the stuff that he brought in, GI Joe, Transformers. He actually wrote a lot of, I think, backstory for the Transformers, ROM, Micronauts. A lot of these things were brought in as well, from toy licenses. So again, he also made use of the licensed characters and projects. Um, the ROM, of course, became very popular. I don't know if Micronauts lasted quite as long, but ROM was that was quite a popular book, if I remember back in the day. Um, it's just again a very sad thing that he had passed. But I feel confident in the knowledge that I think he got the last laugh. I mean, I think a lot of people at the time of his firing or whatever was sort of, jiding him and sort of not giving him his due. But he lived to see his detractors all silenced, and he got the last word, I think, when it came to his legacy. He lived to see himself be appreciated as the hero of comics that he deserved to be seen as. So the people that complained, the people under him that worked for him or whatever, that weren't overall satisfied with what he had done, they didn't get to define him, in other words. Um, I think the legacy he left for comics, being diligent and making sure that the books came out on time, making sure that they were high quality, making sure that they had a standard to aspire to, especially as far as the characters themselves were concerned, is something that, he left for us, and something that we should emulate and learn from those of us who are in the business, as they say. So, once again, thank you, Jim Shooter, for your stewardship of the comics, your stewardship of Marvel, your lighting the way for a lot of us and inspiring us to do comics the right way and to make sure that they're done with the utmost respect for the media, for the medium. And, he is and will always be a hero of mine for his contributions to the art form. And again, check out, there's many interviews with him. Check out any number of them, and you'll see what there really is to appreciate about him and about what he had done for this industry. So once again, thank you, Jim Shooter. God bless. Thank you all for tuning in. If you have any memories or comments that you'd like to make about the legendary Jim Shooter, please do so below. And until next we meet, this is Johnny Torch reminding you once again, keep the flame burning brightly, and I'll be with you again real soon.